Today we are studying about Matthew Arnold, M-A-T-T-H-E-W. Please remember double T. M-A-T-T-H-E-W, Matthew Arnold, A-R-N-O-L-D, Arnold, the famous poet as well as critic during the Victorian age. His period was 1822 to 1888. He was born in 1822 and he died in the year 1888. 1888. Matthew Arnold, the son of Thomas Arnold. His father was Thomas Arnold, who was a renowned headmaster of the Rugby Public School. His father, Thomas Arnold, was the renowned, very famous headmaster of the famous Rugby Public School. We have studied about Rugby Public School, Harrow, Etna, etc. in our earlier classes. Rugby Public School. Yes, once he was born at Laleham in the county of Middlesex. County means a province. Where was he born? He was born at Laleham in the county of Middlesex in UK. Matthew Arnold was born at Laleham in the county of Middlesex. In 1836, Arnold was sent to the Winchester Boarding School. His father was a great educationist. His father was the headmaster of the famous rugby school. And in 1836, in the year 1836, Matthew Arnold was sent to Winchester Boarding School. It was a boarding school where the student had to stay for his studies. Boarding school, Winchester Boarding School. In the year August 1837, in the next year, in August 1837, that means a year later, he was called to be under his father's personal care. He was called to study in Rugby Public School, to be under the personal care of his father Thomas Arnold. In the month August 1837, he was called for being under his father's special care. He won a prize at rugby in the year 1840, for his poem Alaric Room. The poem for which he won a prize while he was studying at Rugby Public School was Alaric Room. Alaric, A-L-A-R-I-C. Alaric Room. It was a long poem. It was rather a long poem, Alaric Room. Then in the year 1841, he went up to Oxford. After his schooling, he went for his college studies. He went up to Oxford University on a scholarship. He was able to pursue his studies on a scholarship. In the year 1841, he went up to Oxford on a scholarship. In the year 1842, his father died. In the year 1842, his father, Thomas Arnold, died. He wrote an elegy on his father, Rugby Chapel. 15 years after his father's death. Matthew Arnold wrote an elegy, a mourning poem, a poem of lamentation, obituary, an elegy on his father, Rugby Chapel, 15 years after his father's death. 15 years later, his father had died. That is the name of the elegy on his father, Rugby Chapel. In 1843, Arnold was also able to win. He won Newdigate Prize for a poem entitled Cromwell. While he was at college, he was able to win a Newdigate Prize. He could win Newdigate Prize for a poem entitled Cromwell. You might have heard of Cromwell. Yes, it is Oliver Cromwell. It was a poem on Oliver Cromwell, English general and statesman. We studied about him in our famous elegy written in a country churchyard. Don't you remember that Oliver Cromwell? So for his long poem on Oliver Cromwell, entitled Cromwell, he was able to win Newdigate Prize. Was an award given to undergraduate students for the best verse, for the best poem, for the best verse. It is an award given to undergraduate students at Oxford for the best composition of verse, which was instituted in the name of Newdigate. Newdigate, that is Newdigate Prize. For which poem he was awarded Newdigate Prize? Cromwell. Cromwell was a poem on the famous English statesman and general Oliver Cromwell. Anyhow, his stay at Oxford University was the happiest part of his life. We can undoubtedly say that his stay at Oxford University was the happiest part of his life. It was his salad days, we can say. Those were the happiest moments in his life, or golden period in his life. Yes, during his stay at Oxford University, he wrote some of his finest poems. Some of his finest poems came out while he was a student at the Oxford University. For example, the Scholar Gypsy, Tircis. Scholar Gypsy and Tircis. You know Scholar Gypsy? Scholar Gypsy is a pastoral elegy. It has all the forms and patterns of a pastoral elegy. Scholar Gypsy is a pastoral elegy based on the story found in Joseph Glanvill's The Vanity of Dogmatizing. There was an author, Joseph Glanville, in his famous work, The Vanity of Dogmatizing. There was a story of a learned student. So that was the theme inspired to Matthew Arnold for the composition of Scholar Gypsy. Scholar Gypsy is a pastoral elegy based on the story found in Joseph Glanville's The Vanity of Dogmatizing. It is the companion poem of Tircis. Scholar Gypsy is of course the companion poem of Tircis. Tircis is also an elegy written on the death of his intimate friend Arthur Hugh Clow. Arthur Hugh Clow, another Victorian poet. Arthur Hugh Clow. Tircis. That is also an elegy. They both are companion poems. Which are companion poems? The Scholar Gypsy and Tircis are companion poems. You know, see, what is the theme? What is the story of a Scholar Gypsy? An impoverished Oxford student. An impoverished Oxford student was dejected. He became extremely sorrowful. He was dejected or disappointed by the fret and fever of modernity. He was totally suffocated by the fret and fever, the conditions of the modernity. And he left his studies to join a band. He left his studies at the Oxford University to join a band, a group of gypsies. Gypsies means the wandering tribe, wanderers, those who loiter about here and there without any special aim. Gypsy group, gypsies, it was a culture, gypsy culture. He joined the scholarly student, he joined a band of a group of gypsies who had a traditional learning and original imagination. So these were the qualities of the gypsies, or these were the qualities that the Oxford student found in the band of gypsies. What were the qualities? They had a traditional learning, traditional knowledge which would never lead us astray, and original imagination. They had original or real or genuine imagination. He joined with them. That is the story of the Scholar Gypsy. The Scholar Gypsy written by Matthew Arnold when he was a student at Oxford. In 1851, he was appointed the inspector of schools. In 1851, he was lucky enough to get a job. What was the job he got? What was the post assigned to him? In 1851, he was appointed the inspector of schools, the examiner of schools, the inspector who would examine the conditions of the schools and report the same to the government. And as an educationist, he was a successful man. And the same year, when he got the financial basis. When he found that his financial basis was sound, that in the same year, means in 1851 itself. In 1851 itself, he got married. He married Frances Lucy Whiteman. Frances Lucy Whiteman. See, what is the name of his wife? Frances Lucy Whiteman. In which year did he get married? He got married in the year 1851. The same year he got the job as inspector of schools. Arnold's legitimate fame, his real fame, lies as a prose writer. Apart from being a poet, his chief fame lies in the fact that he was a great prose writer and critic. He was more of a prose writer and critic than a poet. That is the reality. Arnold's legitimate fame lies as a prose writer and critic. He dealt in poems in his poetry. In his poetry, he dealt with the classical themes, old classical themes. In meditative and melancholy mood. Meditative means thoughtful. Melancholy, sad. In a thoughtful and sad mood, he dealt with the classical themes in his poetry. He deals with the classical themes in meditative and melancholy mood. And also his poems deal with the themes of alienation. Alienation means the feeling that there is nobody to support us. Such a feeling of loneliness. That is what is a sense of alienation. What are the recurrent themes found in his poems? His poems deal with the themes of alienation, stoicism, despair, and spiritual emptiness. So we can see that he was such a pessimist. He had a pessimistic outlook. Why he was pessimistic? Because of his age was like that. His age was the age of Darwin and people questioning the Bible, the Holy Bible, etc. These were the things that made him totally dejected and disappointed or disillusioned. That is why he appeared pessimistic in his outlook. And what are the recurring themes in his poems? Alienation, stoicism, despair, and spiritual emptiness. Spiritual nothingness. These are the themes his poems deal with. Yes, Arnold's poetic career began with the publication of Strayed Reveller and other poems in the year 1849. Arnold's poetry career, his career as a real poet, began with the publication of Strayed, S-T-R-A-Y-D, Strayed Reveller, R-E-V-E-L-L-E-R, Leveller, Strayed Reveller and other poems in the year 1849. Arnold's poetic career began with the publication of Strayed Reveller and other poems in the year 1849. In 1852 came out Empedocles on Etna. Empedocles on Etna about the legends regarding the death of a philosopher and statesman in ancient Greece. Empedocles was a great statesman as well as philosopher in the ancient Greece. Regarding the legends about his death, he wrote the poem Empedocles on Etna. Empedocles, E-M-P-E-D-O-C-L-E-S, Empedocles on Etna in the year 1852. In the year 1852 came out Empedocles on Etna and other poems. Empedocles on Etna and other poems, that is the collection of poems which came out in the year 1852. Empedocles on Etna and other poems. The second volume contained some of his finest poems. The second volume, the volume which followed, contained some of his finest poems. Tristram and Iseult. Tristram and Iseult, which deals with an adulterous love story. The theme is also taken from classical mythology. Tristram and Iseult, which deals with an adulterous, immoral love story. Then a summer night. Another poem, a summer night. And another poem, lines written in Kensington Garden. Lines written in Kensington Garden. Then followed poems. Another title of collection of poems is Poems, which was published in the year 1853 with the famous critical preface. It contained the famous critical preface about poems. See, what is the title of the collection of poems which was published in 1853? Poems itself, poems. What was its speciality? It contained the famous critical preface of Arnold. Critical preface of Arnold. Then came New Poems in the year 1867. New Poems was published in the year 1867, years later. And also in 1858, some years back, 1858, he wrote Merope, a classical tragedy, a verse tragedy, we can say, a verse tragedy, a poetic tragedy, which was extracted from Greek mythology, Merope, M-E-R-O-P, Merope. In which year it came out? In the year 1858. In 1858 came Merope, a classical tragedy. In the same year means in 1858 itself, he became a professor of poetry at Oxford. He was appointed a professor of Oxford. And the interesting thing is that later he only wrote prose. After becoming the professor of poetry, he only wrote prose. That is the interesting fact about his biography. He only wrote prose for the rest of his life. For the rest of his life, he only wrote prose pieces. Like other polymaths, polymath means a man of wide range of knowledge. A man with a wide range of knowledge is called polymath. Polymath. Like other polymaths, he was sensitive to the stresses of the age. Like other great men, he was also sensitive towards the stresses of the age. He dealt with social problems. He often dealt with the social problems in literary, political, and educational writings. In his various realms of writing, that is literary writing, political writing, and educational writing, he dealt with the social problems because he was highly sensitive to the stresses of the age, like the polymaths or the men of great knowledge. He was highly sensitive to the social problems, and he dealt with the social problems in literary, political, and educational writings. Now let us have a panoramic view on his poems, his lyrics, poetic plays, narrative poems, elegies, etc. First of all, let us think about his lyrics. His lyrics, Margaret poems. See, Margaret poems are inspired to him after meeting a beautiful Swiss girl from Switzerland. And thus the poem Margaret poems were inspired to him. Then the Forsaken Merman. Merman is the male version of mermaid. Merman and mermaid are mythical creatures who live in water, who live in the sea. The poem deals with a very touching story. The merman fell in love with a human woman and married her. And children were born to them. They were living happily under the sea. And one day, hearing the Easter bells from the seashore, she decides to go to the land. And the merman thinks that after a short visit to the land, she will come back. But she does not come back. The merman and the children, see, by sitting on the shore of the sea, they are eagerly waiting for the return of the mother or the wife. But she doesn't return. They see her in the house. She is also looking at the sea, but she does not return. It is a poem which really moves us to tears. It is such a pathetic or touching poem. Which is the poem? The Forsaken Merman, the Abandoned Merman, the Forsaken Merman. Then Dover Beach. Dover Beach is a poem which is written in an elegiac note. Soon after marriage, the poet along with his wife go to the beach to enjoy the beautiful sights there. The Dover Beach is a very beautiful place because from the Dover Beach, the French coast is visible. While staying at the Dover Beach, the poet listens to the roaring sound of the sea. But the roaring sound of the sea appeals to him like cries in a pathetic tone. And he feels that the cries are mourning over the death of the spirituality on land. Such an elegiac poem is Dover Beach. Then Scholar Gypsy, we have already discussed. Then Philomela, about a classical theme, Philomela, these are his lyrics. Which are his lyrics? Margaret poems, inspired to him by meeting a very beautiful cis girl, Forsaken Merman, the touching pathetic story, the poem dealing with a pathetic story. Dover Beach, elegiac poem, Scholar Gypsy, Philomela. Then poetic plays, he wrote 2 poetic plays. Empedocles on Etna, Empedocles about the philosopher and statesman in ancient Greece, Empedocles on Etna, and Merope from the Greek classical mythology. Merope. The narrative poems, Tristram and Isolde, the adulterous love, immoral love between a knight and a princess, Tristram and Isolde. And Sohrab and Rustam. The story is taken from the Persian poet Firdausi's Shahnameh. In a single combat, the father, without knowing, father Rustam kills his son Sohrab. Unwittingly, without knowing, the father happens to kill his beloved son Sohrab. That is the story of Sohrab and Rustam, which was inspired to him by Firdausi's, the Persian poet Firdausi's Shahnameh. Then his elegies, Rugby Chapel, Tircis, on the death of his closest friend Arthur, Hugh Clough, Scholar Gypsy, and memorial verses. Rugby Chapel, Tircis, Scholar Gypsy, and memorial verses. Then what are the characteristics or features of Arnold's poetry? See, Arnold is recognized as the greatest elegiac poet of England. He is recognized as, he is counted as, he is reckoned as the greatest elegiac poet of England. It is not because he has written more elegies than other poets, but because the elegiac note runs through almost all his poems. That is why he is called elegiac poet. Arnold is reckoned as the greatest elegiac poet of England because he has written poems on an elegiac note. It is not because he has written more elegies than others, but because the elegiac note runs through all his poems. Even the personal elegies in which the poet laments the death of some close relative or friend, striking a strong note of impersonal grief over the miserable destiny of the human beings, can be discernible or seen. Like Thomas Gray, his elegies are not the death of some important person or friend or close relative, but his elegies are the poems which lament the death of values, the death of great qualities. That is a specialty of the elegies written by Matthew Arnold. In most of his personal elegies, the poet laments, where the poet laments the death of his close relative or friend, a strong note of impersonal grief, a very strong note of impersonal, impartial grief over the miserable destiny of human beings can be seen, can be visible. The subject of Rugby Chapel is his own father. In a southern night, it is his brother. And in Thyrsis we know, it is his, he laments the death of his intimate friend Arthur Hugh Clough. Even in these poems, his keen personal sorrow widens into a general sorrow on the human destiny almost as much as Gray does in the elegy written in a country churchyard. You know, the subject of Rugby Chapel is his own father Thomas Arnold. In a southern night, it is his brother. In Thyrsis, he laments the death of his intimate friend Arthur Hugh Hallam. But even in these poems, his keen personal sorrow widens, extends into a general sorrow on the human destiny almost as much as Gray does in his poem The Elegy written in a country churchyard. Then let us see his prose works. His essays in criticism, his prose work Essays in Criticism, was published in the year 1865. His Essays in Criticism was published in the year 1865. The second series, the second volume, the second series appeared posthumously after his death. Posthumously in 1888, in the year of his death, after his death, but in the year 1888, which contains the famous essays like The Study of Poetry, The Function of Criticism at the Present Times. These are the famous essays which his second series of prose work contains. The second series of essays appeared posthumously in the year 1888, which contains the famous essays like The Study of Poetry, The Function of Criticism at the Present Times. Then in his study of poetry, in the essay Study of Poetry, he says, without poetry, science will appear incomplete. What does he say? Without poetry, science will appear incomplete. In which essay he does, says like this, he says this in his Study of Poetry, in the essay Study of Poetry. In the critical essay Study of Poetry, he continues to say that, see, most of the things passes with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry. He points out that poetry is greater than religion and philosophy, and poetry will certainly replace religion and philosophy forthwith. So most of the things which pass with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry. Then great poetry should have high truth and high seriousness. He also comments that great poetry should have high truth and high seriousness. Matthew Arnold ranks as one of the great English critics. Certainly Matthew Arnold ranks as one of the great English critics. As in his poetry, he shows himself to be an apostle of sanity and culture. As in his poetry, he expresses himself, or he shows himself to be an apostle of sanity and culture. He always upheld sanity, level-headedness, and culture, civilization. As in his poetry, he shows himself as an apostle of sanity and culture. His best books in this class, his best books in the class of critic are Culture and Anarchy. Culture and Anarchy, which was published in the year 1869. And Literature and Dogma, which was published in the year 1873. Literature and Dogma. In the year 1883, he resigned the post of the inspector of schools, receiving a pension from the government. less than 5 years afterwards, less than 5 years afterwards, means after 5 years, he died suddenly of heart disease. What was the cause of his death? Heart disease. So in the year 1888, he died of heart disease. Matthew Arnold. Okay, study all these things about Matthew Arnold, because once again he is remembered mostly as a prose writer and critic rather than a poet.